A warm welcome to session 6 in this series on emotional intelligence. I handled the question of how do we build emotional intelligence in a world that is very dynamic. And I thought that it is important that I add 2 more things to that list so that we can all go on to become the better people that we have been created to become. And so this session 6, I look at 2 additions to the topic, how to build emotional intelligence. If you have not had a chance to look at session 5, please go ahead. And the details on how to get that particular video is, part of this video. So go ahead and watch it. And so when you get to session 6, it will be an addition to what is in session 5. So 2 things that I believe are equally important when we attempt to ask the question and answer the question, how do I build emotional intelligence? So the first addition is know your temperaments. Now, why is it important for you to know your temperaments? Our temperaments play a very central role in how we perceive our world, in how we see our world, in how we interpret our world, and therefore how we respond to our world. So they are very, very central to the responses, in our environment. To the triggers in our environment, which is part of what we said is emotion, is, responses to our emotion. Now, when you take time to know and to understand your temperament, there are 2 things that you get to understand. You get to understand what your strengths are, and you get to understand what your weaknesses are. And of course, in knowing what your strengths are, then you learn to capitalize on those strengths. And of course, in getting to know what your weaknesses are, you get to learn the disciplines to overcome those weaknesses so that they don't become a hindrance to your progression and to your growth. So that is why it is important to understand your temperaments, to know and understand your temperaments. For example, the way a sanguine will respond to one trigger is not the same way a phlegmatic will respond to the same trigger. The 2 will respond to one thing in very different ways. Why? Their temperaments. And you remember we also said that when you know what you're dealing with, then you're able to, understand how to work with it. So in knowing your temperaments, then you know what you're having to deal with and what you do not need to deal with of the inner person. The second addition that I want to make to the conversation on how do I build emotional intelligence is invest and commit to your personal development. Now, many people just go about life as would a river. A river just meanders and finds the easiest path, to flow downstream. And eventually, it ends up in a sea, it ends up in an ocean, or it just disappears somewhere downstream. Now, in life, one cannot afford to be like a river. You have to be intentional about developing yourself. You have to be intentional about who you're becoming. You have to be intentional about what you're doing. You have to be intentional about the things that you pursue and what you want to have. So, you cannot afford to go by the crowds. You cannot afford to go by friends. You cannot afford to just be and just kind of go through life. So that is why I'm saying as you seek to become emotionally intelligent, one of the ways of getting there is invest and commit to your personal development. Be intentional about developing your character. Be intentional about molding your personality. Be intentional about what you're becoming, who you're becoming. And there are many ways of doing that. And I recommend two ways of ensuring that you are investing in your personal development. One is read books. Read books that build you. Read books that build the inner man. Read books that, charge your mind. Read books that challenge your mind. Read books that, guide you and lead you into becoming who you ought to become, building the inner man. Now, I know many people will focus on self-motivation books and, books like How to Become Rich or How to Become Wealthy. That is okay. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those books. But, you can become wealthy and you lose that wealth. And if you look at session 2, 3, and 4, the ones I did on this series, they show us of, 3 different kings who, because they did not have emotional intelligence, 2 of them ended up losing, the gains that they had made. Why? A lack of emotional intelligence. Why? A lack of personal development. So look for books that build the inner man. Look for books that build the person you're becoming, not the things that you're having, the person that you ought to become. Because when you become that person, then it will be very easy for you to do the thing that you need to do, that you ought to do. And then having what you ought to have will just come. So look for, books that build the inner man. And one of the books that I highly recommend, even if you are not a Christian, is the Bible. Read the Bible. Even if you're not a Christian, it is a book I recommend for every human being that lives on this planet Earth. Why? 1, it is broad. Number 2, it's very poetic. Number 3, it has very interesting stories. But even greater than that, it has lots and loads of knowledge and wisdom. It is a book a book that you can get to understand literally everything about this life in one book. And by the way, all knowledge and wisdom stems from the Bible. Just take it, read it. It's not complicated. Just read it. You will get to understand what I'm saying. It's a great book for your personal development. The other thing that I recommend as you look at personal development is work with a coach and work with a mentor. A coach is like a navigator. That person that kind of tells you, this is where we are going, and therefore for us to get there, this is what I recommend that we do so that we can get there within the safest route, using the fastest mean, the safest, and the most effective route. So a coach is like a navigator. So work with a coach. Work with a mentor. I know that on this side of the planet, in the continent of Africa, coaching and mentorship is sort of a foreign thing. But if you really look from the olden days, mentorship and coaching was so central to building leaders. Look at even just the traditional African setup. How were people trained to become who they ought to become? While it may not have been documented, it's a process of coaching. It is a process of mentorship. And so because we have abandoned the traditional ways of doing, now you sort of have to seek for that coach. You sort of have to seek for that mentor. So as you seek to develop yourself personally, look for a good coach, look for a good mentor, let them navigate you through. Let that mentor be like the big brother and the big sister who can tell you things as they ought to be told. Now, as you invest in your personal development, what you're really doing, you are working on overcoming your insecurities. As you invest in your personal development, you are building self-confidence. You are learning the disciplines of life that you need so that you can become who you ought to become, so that you can do what you ought to do, and so that you can have what you ought to have.